identify that they were worshipers of Diana. Now, if you look, Paul is at Ephesus, and then if you go straight across the sea, the Mediterranean, then you come down because the city of Caesarea, right on the coastline, is going to be one of those cities that is identified as having involvement in worship of Diana. Now, if you look on your map and just do a brief measurement, straight across the sea, that's 600 miles from Ephesus to Caesarea. If you go by land, that's going to be probably 3 times as many miles. So this is how far-reaching the worship of Diana was. Because, folks, it's not like us today, and we've mentioned this several times. Just for instance, we set out Friday morning to head home. We left Madison, Indiana, and we drove, stopped in Louisville, spent some time, and anyway, we finally got home about midnight, Friday night, Saturday morning. And in that one day, we drove 850 miles. No, couldn't walk that far. And I rode in what? An air-conditioned vehicle. I had snacks in the vehicle with me. Only time we stopped was pretty much for gas, and we would just kind of refuel and all of that stuff and come on home. But we traveled 850 miles. No, she wasn't driving. No, she wasn't driving. As a matter of fact, Susan didn't drive a single mile of that trip. Not that she can't, it's just she doesn't want to. Because if she drives, she can't do what? She can't play on her games. So anyway, I drove every mile of the trip. But the point I'm trying to make is, let us not fall into thinking that 500 or 600 miles in their day and time is like ours. And so this just testifies to the influence of what we're dealing with here in the city of Ephesus and how prominent it was for people to be worshipers of Diana. And I think we can conclude from that Demetrius was probably making a small fortune off of these little shrines that he was crafting and selling, because people from all over the world came to Ephesus, a seaport town, which was a gateway to Asia and on up into Macedonia and all of that. So they would pass through. And, if you happen to be a worshiper of Diana, and so you come, and going to get to it even in its context, it was well known that Ephesus was the temple guardians of Diana. So this was a Mecca for people to come through. And so now we see some indication, as even though all of Asia wasn't worshiping Diana, because I know of at least one who wasn't, and that would be Paul. But now we get the insight into the influence that this particular worship activity had. Now notice, so not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worship. Now, once again, I want to reiterate, because I stated this last Sunday, this is a powerful statement. How powerful is the gospel? We've talked about the worship activity of Diana. It has gone into 33 different locations that archaeologists have uncovered. It has the influence to travel 500 miles or 600 miles and go from Ephesus to Caesarea. But notice what Demetrius unwittingly. Now, what does unwittingly mean? Unaware. Demetrius is unaware of his testimony he's giving to the power of the gospel. The gospel could turn this world religion upside down. That's what he's admitting to. That's what he's stating. Now, he's not doing it from a positive standpoint, but from a negative standpoint, he's saying that if Paul is allowed to continue to teach what he's teaching, what's going to happen to the worship of Diana? It's going to be overturned. People are going to turn away from it. And we've already seen in this book how influential was the power of the gospel. People brought all their magic books and burnt them. And what's interesting, and didn't bring this out, I don't believe, when we were going through this section, but what's interesting is it says they burnt them, but when you look at this from the Greek, those words which are stated, they burned them or burnt them, it indicates that a fire was started and it burnt for a considerable period of time. It wasn't that they just threw it on it, lit a match to it, and it burned up. There was enough books and material brought that once they lit them on fire, it burnt for an extended length of time. And then we understand that the value is estimated to have been about $35,000 worth of books that they burn up. So now as we think about the influence and the testimony that Demetrius is giving, even though he's unaware of it, he is testifying to the power of the gospel. Now, when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." This term, full of wrath, means that there was great inward indignation. What Demetrius is talking about and the results of what was going to happen if Paul was allowed to continue to teach, we would say that this hurt their feelings. Why was it hurting their feelings? Why was that there, at least on the count of some? Why would this be so hurtful to them? Livelihood. And isn't it always kind of ironic how a lot of men's hearts are in their wallet? He hurt their heart because they knew this was going to affect their bottom line. They were going to suffer on account of this. So now they were full of wrath and they cried out, saying, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." So the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater. Let's talk about this theater for a moment. This theater, as it's been called, or the Colosseum as well, is located on slope Mount Pion, Pion. It was 495 feet in diameter and could accommodate 25,000 people. This was like a small stadium. 25,000 people. Now, I don't know if we had 25,000 people gathered, but I know that the city was filled with confusion. What was confusing them? Do what? Okay, they had a choice to make. All right, am I going to go with Paul and his teaching? Now, what did Paul have on his side? What kind of miracles was God doing through Paul? Extraordinary miracles. Remember, this chapter opens up and Paul is there and they were taking what? The handkerchiefs, what we would call the head wraps and stuff, and they were carrying these to the people, and the people were being healed of diseases, being healed of demonic possession and stuff. So now all of this is on Paul's side. Now, once again, why were miracles being done? What was the point of miracles at all in the first century? Prove the gospel. That's why. So now you look at Hebrews chapter 2 and you read that chapter, you go to Mark 16 and you read that chapter, and the point of miracles was to certify that what the man was teaching, to grasp the attention of his audience, and now he would have their attention, and now as their loved one was being healed or whatever the case might have been, then he would go into preaching the gospel. Well, so now Paul is doing extraordinary, unusual miracles, and he had a great following. Folks, Paul was being talked about, and not just Paul, but Paul and the gospel was being talked about, we'd say, all over town. And then he comes down, Demetrius has gathered up the fellow craftsmen, and now they've got a group gathered up, and so now they're gathered and they're screaming and they're yelling, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And so the whole town, the whole city was confused. And they rushed into the theater or into the Colosseum with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's traveling companions. Now, we don't have a clue as to why they didn't grab Paul. There's nothing historically or nothing in any other text that would tell us why Paul was not gathered up and taken, but we find where Gaius and Aristarchus, they are taken, and they were from Macedonia. Where's Macedonia? In your mind, we cross the Mediterranean Sea, and then we come on up. We have Ephesus, and we have Colossae, and we have Laodicea. And so then this is going to be Asia Minor. And then if you go on up, then we're going to have Athens, and we're going to have Corinth, and we're going to have, then that's going to be Macedonia leading up into Greece. So these were Paul's traveling companions that had come with him, and now they're in the city of Ephesus. And now they have been seized. They're being taken before this crowd. Now, this is not a Jewish crowd. They're not in looking at the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They're not in the Sanhedrin court. They've been carried into the court of Gentiles. And here they are. And so now they're being called in and they're going to be questioned. But now notice in verse number 30, when Paul wanted to go in, the people, then the disciples would not allow him. They were keeping Paul out. Then some of the officials of Asia, or Asiarchs, as some translations would say, who were his friends, sent to him, pleading that he would not venture into the theater or into the Colosseum. So they're trying to keep Paul out of that situation. What might have happened if they'd allowed Paul to go in? Think they'd have killed him? I think the odds are yes. So now these Asiarchs, or these officials of Asia, these were people who were familiar. They were people who had great wealth. These were people who were in position. Historically, if you were an Asiarch, then your family was put into a position within the city, and you occupied and had that position for 1 year. And then you were out. And then someone else would take your place. But what happens is, when you left office, so to speak, then you didn't lose your title. You were observed and honored as an Asiarch for the rest of your life. Now, were these folks Christians? We don't know. But they were whose friend? They were Paul's friend. And he had these people on his side, and he had them on coming to his defense. And once again, when I think about this, who comes to my mind and who might come to your mind? Personally speaking. Folks, I think of Larry Fryer. Larry, of course, we know, Sri Lankan missionary and stuff. But Larry had a lot of brethren that were his friends on the island of Sri Lanka, but he also had a lot of folks who were not Christians that were his friends. And I don't know how many times Larry would get back from a trip, and usually after he'd recuperated a day or two, we'd get together and we'd have lunch, or we'd just sit up here and visit. And he would identify for me what had happened, and he might come home 3 or 4 weeks early. Well, Larry, why did you come home? Because conditions got so bad on the island that some of his friends would come by, non-Christian friends. They would come by and they would say, Larry, get in. We're taking you to the airport. And Larry kept something with him all the time. Anybody know what that was? His go bag. And in that go bag, he had his passport. He had airline ticket, which was just open where he could return at any time. And so that go bag was there. And there were a lot of times he left Sri Lanka, and the only thing he left out of there with was that go bag. But Larry had friends on the island that were non-Christians. And many times they'd come by and they'd say, Larry, the Hindus they're fixing to create a great disturbance in the city, and you need to get out of here. And these men might be Hindu. And yet they would get him and warn him to go to the airport. And they'd get him to the airport, and they would tell him, Larry, do not leave this airport, till he caught a plane and got out of there. Well, Paul had some of these same type of people. They were his friends, and they sent to him, pleading with him not to venture into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused. And most of them, now note this, most of them did not even know why they'd come together. This had turned into what? What kind of mentality? This was now just a mob. You know, we've seen it. We've seen, on the news and stuff where you'll have, riots in certain places and everything. And so you have people that are just caught up in what? The rioting. They don't even know why they're rioting. They're just what? Caught up in it. And so now these things happen, and things sadly go from bad to what? Worse, because of folks being there, and they don't even know why they're there. They just know there's a group that's here, and I'm going to join up with them. Well, that's the same thing that's happened here in Ephesus. Now, if we had a theater half full, or the Colosseum was half full, then let's just say we had 10,000 people in the Colosseum. And here they were all shouting what? Great is Diana, great is Diana. And here comes Gaius and Aristarchus, and they're placed in there. And they're Paul's traveling companions. These individuals were determined they were going to get their pound of what? Flesh from somebody. And so now Paul is convinced to stay out, and yet there are folks who are caught up in all of this, and they don't even know why they are there. Now, verse 33, and they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander motioned with his hand and wanted to make his defense to the people. But when they found out that he was a Jew, all with one voice cried out for about 2 hours, great is Diana of the Ephesians. Now the Jews who were in the city of Ephesus, they thrust this man forward, Alexander. You are going to speak for us. What do you think they wanted him to say? We're not with whom? Paul. We're not with Paul. But then you have those who understood Paul was by nationality Jewish. So as soon as they found out that Alexander was a Jew, then what happens? They just began to scream louder. And they did this for a notable time. Folks, this wasn't something that just happened in 30 minutes, it was over. How long did these folks, residents of Ephesus, those who were worshipers of Diana, those who were in the Colosseum who didn't even know why they were there, what were they yelling for the period of 2 hours? Great is Diana. Great is Diana. Great is Diana. And this went on for 2 hours. Why do you think they stopped? Okay. They got tired, lost their voice. I mean, folks, this is just sort of a crazy thing when you really start to kind of just look at it and just, this is a frenzy. And they're yelling this for the space of 2 hours. Great is Diana of the Ephesians. And when the city clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, Men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians, here we go, is the temple guardian of the great goddess Diana? Once again, he's saying what? The influence of Diana is great. And the influence even and the power of Ephesus is great. We are what? The guardians of the great goddess Diana and of the image which fell down from Zeus. Now, there are a lot of thoughts that the image of Diana was a meteorite that had fallen. And so now they've taken this because it's fallen down from Zeus. It's come down from what? What's Zeus? He's a god. So it's come down from God. And so now they've got this meteorite, perhaps. There's even an image of Diana. Folks, I find this rather interesting. Where was Paul from? What was his native city? Tarsus. You know what they found in Tarsus? A meteorite image worship of whom? Diana. This was not Paul's first exposure to Diana worship. So now here we see where this idea is being expressed that we're the temple guardians and she's fallen down from the gods. Therefore, since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of your goddess. Now, who's he talking about? The men that he's referring. Going to be Gaius and Aristarchus. You've brought these men here, and they're not temple robbers. They're not these people who are out here robbing the temple Diana, nor are they individuals who are blaspheming your goddess. None of what you're saying is what? True. None of this is happening. Therefore, now here's his conclusion. Therefore, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen, now if they have a case against anyone, now what kind of case could he bring against Paul? Had Paul stolen any of his shrines? Had Paul done anything to blaspheme or to speak ill against Diana? All Paul said was God does not what? Dwell in temples made with hands. Now, if Paul has not done that, then Gaius and Aristarchus have not either. Therefore, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a case, the courts are open. Bring your case against them in what? Court. And there are proconsuls. Proconsuls are those who were charged, given authority by whom? Rome, to hear these courts cases. Now, what's not stated here is how historically accurate Luke is. Because one of the things that people have brought up questioning the history or the validity of the book of Acts is this word proconsuls. And so they challenged that. These people weren't, they're imaginary. They're not real. Luke is mistaken. Therefore, since Luke is mistaken, then guess what? Then the whole book, the whole New Testament, everything is off. Everything's wrong. But once again, what is the archaeologist Spade uncovered? Historical evidence that proconsuls were in position and power and were so titled for a period of time. And this is one of those instances. Dale?
I think it carried through, and again, it's brought just different areas set up and governed a little bit different. But Romans, other than Rome and all that, still had a great deal in the gospel that is spread. Because just like situations like this, if it had to do with the Romans, they would probably hang somebody or prove that somebody.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't go so far.
Right.
And they were afraid, once the town council or whatever it was, was afraid we're going to be charged with the right. And they couldn't do it.
Right. And that's going to be what he brings up in just a few moments as he brings this up. But notice he says the courts are open and the proconsuls are in place. And the proconsuls had Rome's what? Authority. All right, Jared?
Go back to Acts chapter 5, you make your device. Kind of similar to level-headed.
Yeah.
It's kind of level-headed. Everybody's crap.
Yeah.
Kind of goes back to me. They were confident.
Yeah, that's it.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. The whole crowd is all praised, and here comes this calm voice that says, hey, you don't want to be found fighting against God. Acts chapter 5, as Gamaliel was brought up. And here we have the city clerk. And now he comes in, and he has this calm voice of reason. And he says, you don't want to do this. You don't want to do something hasty. The councils or the courts are open. The proconsuls are in place. If Demetrius has a legitimate charge, then let him what? Bring it to court. Because then he goes on and he says, let them bring charges against one another. Verse 39, but if you have another inquiry to make, it shall be determined in the lawful assembly. So if it's not something you want to take to the legal system, the court system, then there are those who are also going to assemble. And might be more like a city council that would be assembling. And so when they assembled, then you meet with them and you bring forth your complaints or your charges and let this all be determined or worked out. So now bring those charges in the proper place. Now verse 40, for we are in danger of being called in question for today's uproar. This goes back to the point that Dale was making. They had a greater concern in, that is, the Roman officials or the Roman authorities don't want this. They don't want you causing a disturbance. Now, there being no reason which we may give to account for this disorderly gathering. And how were the Romans, if this was going to continue and charges were brought, then how were the Romans going to come deal with this? Yeah, somebody dies. They're going to send troops in there if they weren't stationed there, or more troops if they had some, and they're going to come in and they're going to quelch this, because the Roman government, the Romans didn't want chaos. All they wanted you to do was what? Pay your taxes. Pay your taxes, and you can do whatever you want to do. They didn't care if you worship Diana. They didn't give one hoot about that. Just don't cause what? A disturbance. And if you cause a disturbance, then we're going to come in and we're going to stop it. And more than likely, you're not going to what? You're not going to like it. Well, the city clerk, he now has this voice of reason, and one where he is trying to get them back into a rational frame of mind, and he does so. And some of those who might have not even understood why they were gathered there in the first place might have thought, oh, yeah, I don't want a Roman soldier coming knocking on my door. I don't want a Roman legion coming in here. Oh, why am I here? I don't know. Is there a back door out of this place? I mean, they want to suddenly now you could see where, oh, yeah, this is stupidity. So they're trying to find a way to get out of there, get back to their home, and get settled back in, and nobody ever know they were what? You think they might ever went, like the next day, gathered at the coffee shop? Yeah, I was there and I was screaming my foolish head off for 2 hours. You think they did that? No. No. Because once again, if the Roman authorities got wind of this and they decided to take action, then if you're going to testify against yourself, then you might find yourself being put to death. So now, when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. Now, when we think about Paul here in the city, Paul didn't do all the evangelizing himself. We look at Acts 19 and verse number 10, and Paul was always training, always motivating others. And some of these well-known associates of Paul are going to be Timothy and Titus. However, there were others we have listed for us here who got called in, Gaius and Aristarchus. They were his companions, and they were from Macedonia. And there are others. And yet possibly from here and at this time, now in Acts 19, these congregations were founded that we've already mentioned. You know, the church at Colossae, the church at Hierapolis, and the church at Laodicea. This could be when these congregations were being established, because the word of the Lord was sounding forth from that place. And we're going to see now that moving into chapter 20, that there are going to be some things in this chapter that are going to be sort of heartbreaking, because the end of this chapter, Paul calls the Ephesian elders to himself. And he gives them great instruction. He gives them great consolation through the Word of God. But then this is also going to be what? The last time they see Paul. And so we'll look at this Wednesday evening, and we'll pick up in chapter 20. And thank you all for your comments this morning.